Hello and welcome back to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic. It is Friday, and that can only mean one thing. The Kitchen Table series returns with deck tech number 35. MTG Burgeoning's longest running series returns with Selesnya Bogles. Hello fans of MTG Burgeoning and hello fans of the Kitchen Table series. Here we are, deck tech number 35. And in today's episode, we are going to take a look at a very nice and spicy Selesnya Bogle build. And it would not take a lot of creativity to make this deck modern playable. A few cards swapped out, a few cards swapped in, and you got yourselves a pretty stalwart modern deck. But we'll get to that as the deck tech goes on. So let's begin. Let's start as usually is customary here at the Kitchen Table series with our land base. So we're going to play with one basic plains, one whole basic plains. To pair with that one basic plains, we are going to play with 4 basic forests. So that's 5 basic lands to start things off. Because we are playing Selesnya colors, we are going to include a playset of Temple Garden. It is of course, our Selesnya Shock land. Come on, camera, get in the game. Oh, belligerent camera. There we go. 4 copies of Temple Garden. Additionally, we are going to play with 1 copy of Windswept Heath. That's going to be our Selesnya Fetch land, of course. We are going to include 2 copies of Razorverge Thicket. It's one of the fast lands from Scars of Mirrodin. It enters the battlefield tapped unless we control 2 or fewer other lands. This is a great turn 1 land to play. 2 copies of Razorverge Thicket. Next up on the docket is 1 copy of Horizon Canopy. Tap, pay a life, add a green or white to your mana pool. Tap 1, tap Horizon Canopy, and sacrifice it to draw a card. 1 copy of Horizon Canopy. And lastly, this would be the playset of lands that would come out in order to make this deck modern playable. And what we're talking about here is because we're at the kitchen table, it's okay to include a playset of Bountiful Promenade. It is the Selesnya fan land from Battle Bond. It enters the battlefield tapped unless we have 2 or more opponents. However, these lands are not modern legal. But at the kitchen table, we'll play with 4 copies of Bountiful Promenade. So if you were planning to take this deck tech and turn it into a modern, viable build, the 4 copies of Bountiful Promenade would come out and be replaced with any number of copies of Razorverge Thicket, Horizon Canopy, and or Windswept Heath. But for the purposes of this kitchen table deck tech, 4 copies, Bountiful Promenade. And that is the land base, folks. Those are all of the lands that are included in this deck build. We do not have a very big overall CMC cost for the spells in this deck. If anything, I'm not even certain there's any spell in here that costs more than 2. And the spells that do cost more than 2, well, we're hoping to get those in our opening hand. So let's move on. Let's talk about what the heck is a Bogle. Well, this is a Bogle. Slippery Bogle is a 1/1 hexproofer for a green or a blue. Don't worry about the blue. There is no splashes of blue in this deck. This is strictly a green creature for all intents and purposes of this deck. And what we're planning to do with the Slippery Bogle and other creatures similar to it is we're going to slap aura after aura after aura on it and attack our opponents until they are dead and we are left victor. 4 copies of Slippery Bogle. A Bogle-like creature, but not a Bogle, is going to be Glade Cover Scout. It's a green, it's hexproof, it's 1/1, it's Bogle number 2. 4 copies of Glade Cover Scout. Shifting away from our hexproof creatures to a different type of creature, we are going to play with a playset of Core Spirit Dancer. 1 and a white, it's an 0/2. However, Course Spirit Dancer gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. And whenever we cast an aura spell, we draw a card. She is a lightning rod for removal. So particularly if Slippery Bogle and Gladecover Scout have hexproof denying spot removal, you can be sure that Core Spirit Dancer is going to be the lightning rod for all of those removal spells. 4 copies of Core Spirit Dancer. And the last of our creatures, rounding it out, creatures 13 through 16, we are playing with a playset of Gaddock Teague. Green and a white, it's a legendary Kithkin Advisor with a 2/2 body. Non-creature spells with converted mana cost 4 or greater can't be cast. Non-creature spells with X in their mana costs can't be cast. This does not affect any of the cards in our hand except for the ones that we want in our opening hand. This will really help to stop our opponents from casting any board wipe that does not target our Bogles, like a Damnation, a Wrath of God, spells like that. So Gaddock Teague can come down and really, really stop our opponents from affecting our board state, which is what we want to do because we want the time and the turns to aura up the Slippery Bogle and then keep attacking until our opponents are no more. So 4 copies of Gaddock Teague. All right, next we are going to play with some removal here. We're going to include a couple copies of Swords to Plowshares. These would be another couple cards that would have to come out in order to make the deck modern legal. 2 copies, Swords to Plowshares, one of the greatest removal spells in the history of Magic. Now, I have alluded to multiple times already during this deck tech that there's a certain card set that we don't want to draw. We want to have it in our opening hand, and that is the Leyline of Sanctity. It's one of the white ley lines for 2 and 2 white, and if it's in our opening hand, we may begin the game with it on the battlefield. And simply, we have hexproof. And why that's important is because there are many, many spells and abilities that will read target player sacrifices a creature. That's a way in which to try to get rid of the Bogles without really targeting them. Some builds in Modern go so far as to include Arbor Elf as a way in which to dance around having to include the Leyline of Sanctity. I'd rather just include one, hoping that there's one in my hand. 4 copies, Leyline of Sanctity as a way in which to protect our Bogles. All right, so far we've got our lands, we've got our creatures, we've got some removal and protection. Now let's talk about this huge stack of auras. But before doing so, let me take a moment just to clean up this spot here so that we can showcase these auras in a more favorable light. All right, that's much better. Okay, so now let's talk about our auras. We are going to play with 4 copies of Rancor. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has trample, and when Rancor is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return Rancor to its owner's hand. 4 copies of Rancor because we can't include 12. And we could if we would, because that is one of the greatest auras ever printed. Staying on color with green, we are going to include 4 copies of Spider Umbra. For just 1 green, enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has reach. But more importantly, it has totem armor. If enchanted creature would be destroyed, instead remove all damage from it and destroy this aura. So the totem aura kind of takes the place of one of our Bogles getting destroyed. 4 copies of Spider Umbra. Next up, and shifting to white, we are going to include 4 copies of Ethereal Armor. For 1 white, it's an aura that says enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. And the camera would, there we go. +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has first strike. 4 copies of Ethereal Armor. Next up, staying with white but returning to the totem armor mechanic, we are going to include 4 copies of Hyena Umbra. A white for enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has first strike, but more importantly again, totem armor is the mechanic that is so important for this Bogle deck. And if enchanted creature would be destroyed, of course, remove all damage from it and destroy this aura instead. 4 copies of Hyena Umbra. And just for the purposes of clarity, with respect to totem armor, it doesn't have to have damage for the totem armor to trigger. If somebody does cast damnation, then we can use the totem armor, and that will destroy and keep our Bogle on the battlefield. 4 copies of Hyena Umbra. And we're down to our last 5 cards, folks. 5 more auras. 2 copies of Spirit Mantle. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has protection from creatures. So you are not going to be able to block our Bogle. 2 copies, Spirit Mantle. And lastly, 3 copies of the bread and butter. This is the game stopper. This is Daybreak Coronet. So for 2 white, we're getting an aura if the camera want to cooperate here. Come on, camera. What are you? There we go. 2 whites, enchanted. They can only be enchanted if there's a creature with an aura already enchanted to it. So that's really important. So do not cast this on one of your Bogles unless your Bogle already has an enchantment aura on it. Because if not, you just can't do it. Because it says enchant creature with another aura attached to it. So if we have one of our Bogles and it already is enchanted by an aura, enchanted creature is going to get +3/+3, first strike, vigilance, and lifelink. And I can attest to the power of this combination. If we have a Bogle that has an aura on it, putting on a Daybreak Coronet, that is almost game. That is almost a guaranteed win. You are pretty much done with that game, particularly if you're throwing on a Rancor or an Ethereal Armor. Daybreak Coronet, 3 copies. Only because I don't own a 4th. And that's going to do it, folks. This is the Kitchen Table Series. This is deck tech number 35. This is Selesnya Bogles. And this is your channel for all things Magic.